John D. 1527 to 1608. A Biography by Charlotte Fell Smith. With portraits and illustrations. London, Constable and Company, Limited, 1909. Table of Contents as summary. Chapter 1, Birth and Education. Tercentenary of D's death. No life of him. Persistent misunderstanding. Birth. Parentage. At Chelmsford Grammar School. St. John's College, Cambridge. Fellow of Trinity. Theatrical enterprise. In the Low Countries. Masters of Arts of Cambridge. Louvain University, Paris. Readings in Euclid. Correspondence abroad. Return to England. Chapter 2. Imprisonment and authorship. Books dedicated to Edward VI. Upton Rectory. Long Leadenham. Books dedicated to Duchess of Northumberland. Fairies informs against his magic. In prison. Handed over to Bonner. At Philpot's trial. Efforts to found a state library. Astrology. Horoscopes. Choice of a day for Queen Elizabeth's coronation. Introduced to her by Dudley. Sympathetic magic. Bachelor of Divinity. In Antwerp. Mons Hagiographica. Preface to Billingsley's Euclid. Called a Conjurer. Chapter 3. Mortlake. Proposed Benefice. Propedumata Aphoristica. Alchemical Secrets. Settled at Mortlake. Journey to Lorraine. Illness. The Queen's Attentions. Mines and Hidden Treasure. Wigmore Castle. Marriage. Death of First Wife. Literary Correspondence. John Stowe. Diary commenced. The Hexamoron. Britannicum. The British Compliment. Slander and Falsehood. A Petty Navy. The Sea Power of Albion. Fisheries and Foreign Policy. Chapter 4. Jane D. A Comet or Blazing Star. Second Marriage. Jane Fromond. Hurried Journey Abroad. Berlin and Frankfurt. Birth of a Son. Christening. Edward Dyer. Duke de Alenjon. Michael Locke. His Sons. The Queen's Visit. Sir Humphrey Gilbert at Mortlake. Adrian Gilbert. John Davis. The Queen's Title Royal. Lord Treasurer Burleigh. Death of Dee's mother. The Queen's Visit of Condolence. Map of America. Visits to the Muscovy House. Frobisher and Hawkins. Birth of a Daughter. Accident to author. Chapter 5. The Search for a Medium. Assistants: Roger Cook, Magic and Alchemy, Psychic Powers, Crystal Gazing, Dreams and Mysteries, Vincent Murphy and a Lawsuit, Jean Baudin Visits England, Quarrel between Leicester and Sussex, Mary Herbert, Sir George Peckham, The Stage at Paris Garden, Mr. Secretary Walsingham, The Queen at Greenwich, Barnabas Saul as Medium, Edward Talbot, Sight in the Stone, The Table of Practice, The Waxen Seals. Chapter 6. Edward Kelly. Edward Kelly, an alias, his previous history, his mysterious powder, marriage to Joan Copper, Jane Dee's dislike of Kelly, the diary of the actions, how Ashmole obtained the manuscript, Book of Mysteries, the Four Angels, Dee's thirst for hidden knowledge, a crystal is brought, Medicina. Chapter 7. The Crystal Gazers. Kelly, the Scryer, a third person, Adrian Gilbert, Kelly and Anne Eluder, Dee employed to reform the calendar, The Queen and Raleigh, Hidden Treasure, Burleigh's Library, Dee's Precious Books, Kelly's Rebellious, Threatens to Depart, Kelly Rebellious Threatens to Depart, Pacified by Adrian Gilbert, His Wife's Letters, He Goes to London, Becomes Clairvoyant, Sees Mary Queen of Scots Executed. Chapter 8. Madimi. Straits for Lack of Money, Count Albert Lasky, Aspirations toward the Polish Crown, King Stephen Bathory, Dee introduced to him by Leicester, Lasky at Oxford, at Mortlake, Madimi, Galva or Venice, Lasky's guardian angel, Madimi, a linguist, Kelly threatens to leave, his salary of £50, Thomas Kelly, Dee's suspicions, Kelly's temper, his love of money. Chapter 9. A Foreign Journey, Gifts from the Queen, Departure from Mortlake, Lasky and the whole party sail from Gravesend, Queensborough, the Brill, Haarlem, Amsterdam, Harlingen, Dukum, Instructions from Gabriel, Emden, Oldenburg, Bremen, Il's Levity, Visions of England, Hamburg, Lübeck. Chapter 10. Promises and Visions, Promises of Wealth, Dee's Doubts, his books and library destroyed by the mob, Rostock, Stettin, Posen Cathedral, severe winter weather, the table set up, Nalveg, Sir Harry Sidney, Madimi, the Queen's affection, at last, Krakow. Chapter 11. Krakow. Krakow, the New Style, Dee's work on the reformation of the calendar, Kelly's discontent, geographical lessons, Lasky and King Stephen, Kesmark, Gabriel's pleading, Kelly repentant, a vision of 4 castles, Ave, Dee's patience. Chapter 12. From Krakow to Praha. Roland's illness, Dee sets out for Prague, Thomas Kelly, Dr. Hageck's house, Rudolph II, Simon's study, Interview with the Emperor, Kelly's Outbursts, Dr. Jacob Curtius, Dee's Natural History, The Spanish Ambassador, Jane D. Ill, A Passport Granted, Back to Prague, Kelly's Doubts. Chapter 13, A Dream of Gold, to Limburg, Michael baptized in Prague Cathedral, Easter, Poverty and Distress, Kelly again restive, Parabola de Nobis Duobus, Return to Krakow, Mr. Tebaldo, Interview with King Stephen, His Death, Dr. Anibaldus, Back to Prague, Francisco Pucci, The Book of Enoch, Claves Angelicae, Banished by Papal Edict, William Count Rosenberg, D. at Leipzig, Letter to Walsingham, A New Nuncio, Invitation to Trebona. Chapter 14, The Castle of Trebona. Trebona Castle, Rosenberg, Viceroy of Bohemia, Invitation to Russia, Projection with Kelly's Powder, A Gift to Jane D., Letter from Kelly, Jane to her husband, Joan Kelly. Dee's friends desert him for Kelly, author to be the scryer, Kelly's pretended vision, a hard and impure doctrine, Dee's scruples overridden, a solemn pact, Kelly disowns blame, end of his clairvoyance, the spirit's diary closed. Chapter 15, The End of the Partnership, Letters to Walsingham, A Tutor for the Children, Coldness and Jealousy, Furnaces Constructed, Rumors and Reports, Book of Dunstan, Kelly's Haughtiness, Accident to Michael, The Great Secret, Kelly Steals the Best Workman, Break Up the Trebona Family, Dee's Letter to the Queen on Armada, Gifts to Kelly, His Departure, Coaches and Horses Provided, Dee Quits Bohemia, Arrival in Bremen. Chapter 16, The End of Kelly. Kelly in favor with Rudolph, given a title, corresponds with Dee, fabulous stories of gold. Burleigh begs his return to England, a token to be sent, a prescription for his gout, letter to Kelly, Kelly's fall from favor, flight from arrest, capture at Sobislus, imprisonment, writings on alchemy, letters to Dee, attempted escape, death. Chapter 17, Return to England, Dee's life in Bremen, letter of safe conduct from the Queen. Writes to Walsingham, Timon Cochitius, Heinrich Kunrath, departure for England, Dr. Pizel, events in England since Dee left, arrival at court, offers of friends, Medenia born, school for the children, death of Walsingham, Richard Cavendish, Anne Frank, the Queen at Richmond, Christmas gifts. Chapter 18, A Royal Commission, loss of income, hopes of a benefice, the court at Nunsuk, Mary Herbert, Arthur sent to Westminster School, his disposition, birth of Francis, Dr. William Aubrey, deferred hopes, the commissioner's visit, compendious rehearsal, Dee's half-hundred years, The Blind Lady Fortune. Chapter 19. Dee's Library. The Library at Mortlake. Books and Instruments. Richard Chancellor's Quadrant. A Radius Astronomicus. Mercator's Globes. A Watch Clock by Dibley. Boxes of manuscripts. Seals and coats of arms. Records for the Tower. Autograph works. Records. Ground of Artists. Catalogue of the books. Classic authors. English authors. Chapter 22. Adieu to Courts and Courting. The Queen's Gift. Anne, Countess of Warwick. Christmas at Tooting. Francis Nichols. Visitors to Mortlake. The Lord Keeper. Elizabeth Crichton. Messengers from Lasky. Mr. Webb. Bartholomew Hickman. The Queen at Greenwich. Advantages of St. Cross. Archbishop Whitgift. The whole family to see the Queen. Adieu to Courts and Courting. Michael's death. Chancellor of St. Paul's. Jane's supplication. A post at last. Manchester College. Birth of Marguerite. Lord Derby. A move northward. Chapter 21. Manchester. Collegiate Church of Manchester. The Byrons of Clayton. Cotton's servant. Titles of the college lands. Mr. Harry Saville. Surveys of the town. Christopher Saxton. A surprise visit. Governess for the girls. Witchcraft in Lancashire. Dee's Library in request. Disputes among the fellows. Perambulation of the bounds. Richard Hooker. Marking boundaries. Earl and Countess of Derby. College affairs. The Queen's sea sovereignty. Letter to Sir Edward Dyer. Humphrey Davenport. Sir Julius Caesar. Welcome gifts. Journey to London. Chapter 22. College affairs. Absence from Manchester. A special commission. Return to the north. Grammar school inspection. Dreams and sleepless nights. Trouble with the fellows. Unsatisfactory curates. Borrowing money on plate. Crystal gazing again. Untrue visions. Return of Roger Cook. College property in Cheshire. Arthur, the chapter clerk. End of the diary. Chapter 23. Last days. Death of Theodore. Author's marriage. His horoscope. Death of the Queen. James I and his demonology. Act against witchcraft. Dee petitions Parliament and the King at Greenwich. Passionate protest. Offers to be burned. Pleads for an act against slander. Neglected and alone. Death of Jane. The children ill. Dee in London. Catherine his mainstay. Cruel delusions. A journey to go. Failing memory. John Pontoise. The vision fades. Death. A grave at Mortlake. Garrulous reminiscences. Appendices 1 and 2. 1. Dee's descendants. 2. A bibliography. There is a list of instructions. The first, a portrait of John Dee. From the original, artist unknown, in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford. It is inscribed on the face, Johannes Dee, Anglus Londinensis et Sue 67. The portrait was acquired by Ashmole from Dr. John Dee's grandson Roland and was left by him to Oxford University with his collections. It has been engraved by Schnicker and W.P. Sherlock. 2. Title page of Dee's general and rare memorials pertaining to the perfect art of navigation, printed by John Day, 1577. The motto, plura latent quam patent, surrounds the title. Above the Queen's arms, a rose branch through a loop at each end, allegorical, drawing in a square. The date 1576 in Greek in the corners. The Queen seated at the helm of a capital, in essence, first class ship, arms of England on the rudder, 3 noblemen standing in the waist. On the vessel's side, Jupiter and Europa. Signs of famine on shore. A wheat ear upside down on a skull. A Dutch ship is anchored in the river. 4 more lie at its mouth. Soldiers, a small boat, a man offering a purse, and in the corner a walled town. On the rock at the river's mouth stands Lady Opportunity, the angel Raphael overhead with flaming sword and shield bearing St. George's cross. The sun, moon, and 10 stars. Rays of glory proceeding from the name Jehovah. See Ames, Typographical Antiquities, Editor Herbert, Volume 1, page 661. Number 3. Picture of an alchemist with his assistant tending stills. From an engraving by Robert Vaughan in Ashmole's Theatrum Chemicum Brittonum, where it illustrates the first English translation of Thomas Norton's Ordinal of Alchemy, a metrical treatise in Latin, which Dee transcribed in the year 1577. His copy, bound in purple velvet and with the index made by himself, is now Ashmolean Manuscript 57. Number 4. Diagram of the Vision of 4 Castles, seen and drawn by Kelly at Krakow, from Casaubon's True Relation. Five, facsimile photograph of Dee's letter to Queen Elizabeth on the defeat of the Spanish Armada, from the original in Harleian Manuscript 6986, folio 45. Number 6, a page from the album of Timon Cochius, Bremen, 1589, Dee's contribution to his Thesaurus Amicorum, from the original in additional manuscript 19.065. Number 7, illustration to Norton's Ordinal, engraved by Vaughan in Ashmole's Theatrum. See above, number 3. Dee's coat of arms, number 8, from an illustration to his letter and apology, presented to the Archbishop of Canterbury, 1599, second edition, 1603. John Day, Chapter 1. A benediction. Aka, dua, tuf ud, biu, bi a chifu, dudu, nur af anu teru. O High One, may he be praised, the one great of power, the spirit of great dignity, who places fear of himself among the gods. Will. Do what thy wilt shall be the whole of the law. What is thy will? It is my will to eat and drink and be quenched. To what end? That my body may be fortified thereby. To what end? That I may accomplish the great work. Love is the law. Love under will. Fall 2. Birth and education. O incredulities, the wit of fools, that slovenly will spit on all things fairy, the coward's castle and the sluggard's cradle. How easy 'tis to be an infidel. George Chapman. It seems remarkable that 300 years should have been allowed to elapse since the death of John Dee in December 1608. Erevogel. Without producing any life of an individual so conspicuous, so debatable, and so remarkably picturesque. There is perhaps no learned author in history who has been so persistently misjudged, nay, even slandered, by his posterity, and not a voice in all the 3 centuries uplifted even to claim for him a fair hearing. Surely it is time that the cause of all this universal condemnation should be examined in the light of reason and science, and perhaps it will be found to exist mainly in the fact that he was too far advanced in speculative thought for his own age to understand. For more than 50 years out of the 81 of his life, Dee was famous. Day was famous, even if suspected and looked askance at as clever beyond human interpretation. Then his queen died. With the narrow-minded Scotsman who succeeded her came a change in the fashion of men's minds. The reign of His Highness and his handmaidens, the witches and possessed persons, was set up in order to be piously overthrown, and the very bigotry of the times gave birth to independent and rational thought. To Newton, Bacon, Locke, but Day was already labeled once and for all. Every succeeding writer who has touched upon his career has followed the leaders blindly and has only cast another and yet another stone to the heap of obloquy piled upon his name. The fascination of his psychic projections has always led the critic to ignore his more solid achievements in the realms of history and science, while at the same time these are the only cited to be loudly condemned. The learned Dr. Merrick Casaubon, who 50 years after Dee's death edited his Book of Mysteries, The absorbing recital of 4 out of the 6 or 7 years of his crystal gazing was perhaps the fairest critic he yet has had. Although he calls these spiritual revelations a sad record and a work of darkness, he confuses that he himself and other learned holy men, including an archbishop, read it with avidity to the end and were eager to see it printed. He felt certain, as he remarks in his preface, that men's curiosity would lead them to devour what seems to him not paralleled in that kind by any book that hath been set out in any age to read. And yet on no account was he publishing it to satisfy curiosity, but only to do good and to promote religion. For Day, he is persuaded, was a true, sincere Christian. His relation made in the most absolute good faith, although undoubtedly he was imposed upon and deluded by the evil spirits whom he sometimes mistook for good ones. It may be well here to remark that this voluminous book of mysteries, or True and Faithful Relation, folio 1659, from which in the following pages there will be found many extracts, abounds in tedious and unintelligible pages of what Casaubon calls sermon-like stuff, interspersed with passages of extraordinary beauty. Some of the figures and parables, as well as the language used, are full of a rare poetic imagery, singularly free from any coarse or sensual symbolism, like jewels embedded in dull settings. Here and there a gem of loftiest religious thought shines and sparkles. There are descriptive touches of costume and appearance that possess considerable dramatic value. As the story is unfolded in a kind of spiritual drama, the sense of a gradual moving development and the choice of a fitting vehicle in which to clothe it is striking. The dramatis personae, too, the spiritual creatures, who, as they believed, influence the destinies of men, become living and real, as of course they were to the seer. In many respects, these actions were an exact counterpoint of the dealings inaugurated by psychical science 275 years later, if we omit the close investigation for fraud. Casaubon's successor in dealing with the shunned and avoided subject of John Day was Thomas Smith, Fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, who, in 1707, wrote the first connected life of him in a book of the lives of learned men. It was based upon some of these autobiographical papers, and out of a total of 100 pages, gave 50 to letters already printed by Casaubon. After this, no sustained account of Dee's romantic career is to be found outside the pages of biographical dictionaries and magazine articles, or among writers upon necromancy, Hermetic philosophy, and alchemy. Many of these decorate their collections with apocryphal marvels culled from the well-worn traditional stories of Day and his companion, Edward Kelly. Thus, throughout his life, and since he has continued to run the gauntlet of criticism, old imposturing juggler, fanatic, quack are mild terms. In the Biographia Britannica, he is called extremely credulous, extravagantly vain, and a most deluded enthusiast. Even the writer on day in the Dictionary of National Biography says his conferences with the angels are such a tissue of blasphemy and absurdity that they might suggest insanity. Many more such summary verdicts might be quoted, but these will suffice for the present. It has been said that no life of day exists, and yet the materials for such a life are so abundant that only a selection can be used here. His private diary, for instance, if properly edited, would supply much supplementary, useful, and interesting historical information. It is the object of this work to present the facts of John Dee's life as calmly and impartially as possible, and to let them speak for themselves. In the course of writing it, many false assertions have disentangled themselves from truth. Many doubts have been resolved, and a mass of information sees the light for the first time. The subject is, of course, hedged about with innumerable difficulties, but in spite of the temptations to stray into 100 bypaths, an endeavor has been strictly made to do no more than throw a little dim light on the point where the paths break off from the main road. If at the end of the way any who have persevered so far feel they have followed a magnetic and interesting personality, the labor expended will not have been in vain. With a word of apology to serious historical readers for the incorrigibly romantic tendency of much of the narrative, which, in spite of the stern sentinel of a literary conscience, would continually reassert itself, the story of our astrologer's strange life may now begin. John Day was the son of Roland Day. He was born in London, according to the horoscope of his own drawing, on July 13th, 1527. His mother was Jane, daughter of William Wilde. Various Welsh writers have assigned Day a genealogical descent of the highest antiquity, and the pedigree which he drew up for himself in later life traces back his family history from his grandfather, Bedu Day, to Roderick the Great, Prince of Wales. All authorities agree that Radnor was the county from whence the Days sprang. Roland Day, the father, held an appointment at court as gentleman server to Henry VIII, but was very indifferently treated by the king. This may partly account for the persistence with which Day exhibited before Queen Elizabeth his claims to preferment at her hands. To be in habitual attendance at court in those days, however, bred in men a great desire for place, and a courtier was but a mendicant on a grand scale. The boy, John Day, was early bred in grammar learning, and was inured to Latin from his tender years. Perhaps he was not more than 9 or 10 when he was sent to Kemsfield, to the chantry school founded there 7 years before the great school at Winchester came into existence. The master who presided over Day's school hours in Essex was Peter Wheeley, whom the chantry commissioners in 1548 reported as a man of good conversation, who had kept the school there for 16 years. Day has always been claimed by the grammar school at Kemsford as one of their most famous alumni, whose extraordinary career with its halo of mystery and marvel they perhaps feel little qualified to explore. Day's testimony that at Kemsfield he was mentally well furnished with understanding of the Latin tongue is an unconscious tribute to Peter Willey's teaching. In November 1542, Day, being then 15 years and 4 months old, left Kempsfield to enter at St. John's College, Cambridge, where, as he tells us in his autobiography, he soon became a most assiduous student. In the years 1543, 1544, 1545, I was so vehemently bent to study that for those years I did invariably keep this order, only to sleep 4 hours every night, to allow to meat and drink, and some refreshing after, 2 hours every day, and of the other 18 hours, all except the time of going to and being at divine service, was spent in my studies and learning. Early in 1546 he graduated B.A. from St. John's College. At the close of the same year, Trinity College was founded by Henry VIII, and Dee was selected one of the original fellows. He was also appointed under-reader in Greek to Trinity College, the principal Greek reader being then Robert Pember. The young fellow created the first sensation of his sensational career soon after this by arranging some of the Edeni piece of Aristophanes, in which he apparently acted as stage manager and carpenter. For this play, he devised a clever mechanical and very spectacular effort. For this play, he devised a clever, mechanical, and very spectacular effort. Trigeus, the Attic vine dresser, carrying a large basket of food for himself, and mounted on his gigantic beetle or scarab, which ate only dung, was seen ascending from his dwelling on the stage to enter the palace of Zeus in the clouds above. One has only to think of the scenic effects presented by Faust and Mephistopheles at Mr. Tree's theater, for instance, to realize how crude and ineffective these attempts must have been. But 30 or 40 years before Shakespeare's plays were written, so unusual an exhibition was enough to excite wild rumors of supernatural powers. We hear no more of theatrical performances, although several references in his afterlife serve to show that his interest in the English drama, about to be born, lagged not far behind that of his great contemporaries. He does mention, however, a Christmas pastime in St. John's College, which seems to have been inspired by the same dramatic spirit. Of details we are totally ignorant. He only relates that the custom of electing a Christmas magistrate was varied at his suggestion by crowning the chosen victim as emperor. The first imperial president of the Christmas revels in St. John's College was one Mr. Thomas Dunn, a very goodly man of person, stature and complexion, and well learned also, evidently a presence fit for a throne. Day adds, they which yet live and were hearers and beholders, they can testify more than is meet here to be written of these my boyish attempts and exploits scholastical. He turned to sterner studies, and became a skillful astronomer, taking thousands of observations, very many to the hour and minute, of the heavenly influences and operations actual in this elemental portion of the world. These he afterwards published in various ephemerides. In May 1547, Day made his first journey abroad to confer with learned men of the Dutch universities upon the science of mathematics, to which he had already begun to devote his serious attention. He spent several months in the Low Countries, formed close friendships with Gerard Mercator, Gemma Frisius, Johannes Caspar, Myriceus, the Orientalist Antonius Gogava, and other philosophers of worldwide fame. Upon his return to Cambridge, he brought with him two great globes of Mercator's making, and an astronomer's armillary ring and staff of brass, such as Frisius had never devised and was in the habit of using. These he afterwards gave to the fellows and students of Trinity College. He cites a letter of acknowledgment that John Christopherson, afterwards Bishop of Chichester, but upon search being made for the objects recently, through the kindness of the Master, it appears they are not now to be found. Day returned to Cambridge in the year 1548 to take his degree of M.A., and soon after went abroad. And never after that was I any more student in Cambridge. Before he left, he obtained under the seal of the Vice-Chancellor and Convocation, April 14, 1548, a testimonial to his learning and good conduct, which he proposed to take with him abroad. Many times did he prove it to be of some value. In midsummer term 1548, he entered as a student at the University of Louvain, which had been founded more than 100 years before in this quaint old Brabantian town of medieval ramparts and textile industries. At Louvain, Day continued his studies for 2 years, and here he soon acquired a reputation for learning quite beyond his years. It has been presumed that he here graduated doctor to account for the title that he has always been given, Dr. Day. Certainly possesses an alliterative value not to be neglected. At Cambridge, he was only M.A. Long after, when he had passed middle life, and when his remarkable genius in every branch of science had carried him so far beyond the dull wit of people who surrounded him that they could only explain his manifestations by the old cry of sorcery and magic, Day made a passionate appeal to the Queen, his constant patron and employer, to send 2 emissaries of her own choosing to his house at Mortlake, and bid them examine everything they could find, that his character might be cleared from the damaging charges laid against him. He prepared for these 2 commissioners, to whose visit he shall revert in its proper place, an autobiographical document of the greatest possible value, which he calls the Compendious Rehearsal of John Day. His dutiful declaration and proof of the course and race of his studious life, for the space of 100 years, now, by God's favor and help, truly spent. It is from this narrative that the facts of his early life are ascertainable. Perhaps we discern them through a faint mist of retrospective glorification, for which the strange streak of vanity, almost inseparable from attainments like these, was accountable. But there is every reason to reply But there is every reason to rely upon the accuracy of the mathematician's story. Beyond the seas, far and near, was a good opinion conceived of my studies, philosophical and mathematical. People of all ranks began to flock to see this wonderful young man. He gives the names of those who came to Louvain, a few hours' journey from Brussels, where the brilliant court of Charles V was assembled with evident pride. Italian and Spanish nobles, the Dukes of Mantua and Medina Gelli, the Danish king's mathematician Matthias Hagius, and his physician Johannes Capetto, Bohemian students all arrived to put his reputation to the test. A distinguished Englishman, Sir William Pickering, afterwards ambassador to France, came as his pupil to study astronomy. By the light of Mercator's globes, the astrolabe, and the astronomer's ring of brass that Frisius had invented. For his recreation, the teacher looked into the method of civil law and mastered easily the points of jurisprudence, even those accounted very intricate and dark. It was Louvain, no doubt. It was at Louvain, no doubt, that his interest in the subject of alchemy became strengthened and fixed. Stories were rife, of course, of the famous alchemists, Henricus Cornelius Agrippa, who had died there, in the service of Marguerite of Austria, only a dozen years or so before. Agrippa had been secretary to the Emperor Maximilian, had lived in France, London, and Italy, and Louvain, no doubt was bursting with his extraordinary feats of magic. The 2 years soon came to an end, and a couple of days after his 23rd birthday, young Day left the Low Countries for Paris, where he arrived on July 20th, 1550. His fame had preceded him, and within a few days, at the request of some English gentlemen and for the honor of his country, he began a course of free public lectures or readings in Euclid, mathematics, physics, et Pythagoras, at the College of Reims in Paris, a thing, he says, which had never been done before in any university in Christendom. His audience, most of them older than himself, was so large that the mathematical schools would not hold them, and many of the students were forced in their eagerness to climb up outside the windows, where, if they could not hear the lecturer, they could at least see him. He demonstrated upon every proposition, and gave dictation and exposition. A greater astonishment was created, he says, than even at his Scarabaeus mounting up to the top of Trinity Hall in Cambridge. The members of the university in Paris at the time numbered over 4,000 students, who came from every part of the known world. He made many friends among the professors and graduates, friends of all estates and professions, several of whose names he gives, among them the learned writers and theologians of the day, Orontius, Mizaldus, Petros, Montarus, Ronconetus, Ranconet, Fernelius, and Francis Silvius. The fruit of these years spent in Louvain and Paris was that Dee afterwards maintained throughout his life a lively correspondence with professors and doctors in almost every university of note upon the continent. He names especially his correspondence in the universities of Orleans, Cologne, Heidelberg, Strasbourg, Verona, Padua, Ferrara, Bologna, Urbino, Rome, and many others, whose letters lay open for the inspection of the commissioners on that latter visit alluded to. An offer was made him to become a king's reader in mathematics in Paris University, with a stipend of 200 French crowns yearly. But he had made up his mind to return to England, and nothing would tempt him to stay. He received other proposals, promising enough to enter the service of M. Bebo, M. de Rohan, and M. de Montluc, who was starting as special ambassador to the Great Turk. But his thoughts turned back to England, and thither, in 1551, he bent his steps. Chapter 2, Imprisonment and Authorship. A man is but what he knoweth. Bacon. In December 1551, Dee obtained through the offices of Mr., afterwards Sir, John Cheke, an introduction to Secretary Cecil and to King Edward VI. He had already written for and dedicated to the king 2 books in manuscript, De Usi Globi Coelestis 1550 and De Nubium Solis Lunae Act Reliquarum Planetarum, etc. 1551. These perhaps had been sent to Cheke, the king's tutor, in the hope that they might prove useful lesson books. The pleasing result of the dedication was the gift of an annual royal pension of 100 crowns. This allowance was afterwards exchanged for the rectory of Upton upon Severn in Worcestershire, which Dee found an extremely bad bargain. From the beacon hill above West Malvern Priory, the visitor may turn from the inspection of the ancient British camp of Caractacus to admire the magnificent view, and across the level fields where the Severn winds, the tower of Upton Church will be seen rising in the middle distance. Further west, if the day be clear, the more imposing towers of Tewkesbury and Gloucester may be discerned, while half a turn eastward will show Worcester Cathedral not far away. Day never lived in this beautiful place, although he was presented to the living on May 19, 1553. Even when the rectory of Long Leadenham in Lincolnshire was added to Upton, the two together were worth only about £80 a year. Next year he declined an invitation to become lecturer on mathematical science at Oxford, conveyed to him through Mr. Dr. Smith, Richard D.C.L., 1528, the Reformer, of Oriel College, and Mr. Du Bruni of Christ Church. He was occupied with literary work, and in 1553 produced, among other things, a couple of works on the cause of floods and ebbs, and the philosophical and political occasions and names of the heavenly astronomies, both written at the request of Jane, Duchess of Northumberland. When Mary Tudor succeeded her young brother as queen in 1553, Day was invited to calculate her nativity. He began soon after to open up a correspondence with the Princess Elizabeth, who was then living at Woodstock, and he cast her horoscope also. Before long he was arrested on the plea of an informant named George Ferrys, who alleged that one of his children had been struck blind and another killed by Day's magic. Ferrys also declared that Day was directing his enchantments against the queen's life. Day's lodging in London were searched and sealed up, and he himself was sent to prison. He was examined before the Secretary of State, afterwards upon 18 articles by the Privy Council, and at last brought into the Star Chamber for trial. There he was cleared of all suspicion of treason, and liberated by an order in council. August 29, 1555, but handed over to Bishop Bonner for examination in matters of religion. Bonner was apparently equally satisfied. Dee was certainly enjoined by him at John Philpot's examination on November 19, 1555, to put questions as a test of his orthodoxy. He quoted St. Cyprian to Philpot, who replied, "Master Day, you are too young in divinity to teach me in the matters of my faith, though you be more learned in other things." Day deserves well of all writers and students for time everlasting, because of his most praiseworthy efforts to found a state national library of books and manuscripts with copies of foreign treasures, wherever they might be. On January 15, 1556, he presented to Queen Mary a supplication for the recovery and preservation of ancient writers and monuments. Within a few years, he had seen the monasteries dissolved and the priceless collections of these houses lamentably dispersed, some burned and others buried. He drew up a very remarkable address to the Queen, dwelling on the calamity of thus distributing the treasure of all antiquity and the everlasting seeds of continual excellency within this your Grace's realm. Many precious jewels, he knows, have already perished, but in time there may be saved and recovered the remnants of a store of theological and scientific writings, which are now being scattered up and down the kingdom, some in unlearned men's hands, some walled up or buried in the ground. Day uses powerful arguments to enforce his plea, choosing such as would make the most direct appeal to both Queen and people. She will build for herself a lasting name and monument. They will be able, all in common, to enjoy what is now only the privilege of a few scholars, and even these have to depend on the goodwill of private owners. He proposes first that a commission shall be appointed to inquire what valuable manuscripts exist, that those reported on shall be borrowed on demand, a fair copy made, and if the owner will not relinquish it, the original be returned. Secondly, he points out that the commission should get to work at once, lest some owners, hearing of it, should hide away or convey away their treasures. And so, he pithily adds, prove by a certain token that they are not sincere lovers of good learning, because they will not share them with others. The expenses of the commission and of the copying, etc., he proposed should be borne by the Lord Cardinal and the Synod of the province of Canterbury, who should also be charged to oversee the manuscripts and books collected until a library apt in all points is made ready for their reception. Finally, these suggest that to him be committed the procuring of copies of many famous manuscript volumes to be found in the great libraries abroad, the Vatican Library at Rome, St. Mark's at Venice, and in Bologna, Florence, Vienna, etc. He offers to set to work to obtain these, the expenses only of transcription and carriage to England to be charged to the state. As to printed books, they are to be gotten in wonderful abundance. In this generous offer of his life to be spent in transcribing crabbed manuscripts, we cannot see the restless genius of John Day, long satisfied, but at any rate he proved himself not seeking for private gain. Thus was the germ of a great national library first started by the Cambridge mathematician, nearly 50 years before Thomas Bodley opened his unique collection at Oxford, and close upon 200 years before there was founded in the capital the vast and indispensable book mine, known to all scholars at home and abroad as the British Museum. The Historical Manuscripts Commission, whose labors in cataloging private collections of archives are also foreshadowed in Day's supplication, only came into being with the appointment of keepers of the public records, by an act signaling the first and second year of Queen Victoria's reign. It is needless to say that nothing came of Day's very disinterested proposition, so he became the more industrious in collecting a library of his own, which soon consisted of more than 4,000 volumes, which were always at the disposal of friends who came often to see him. They came also for another reason. Astrology was a very essential part of astronomy in the 16th century, and the belief in the controlling power of the stars over human destinies is almost as old as man himself. The relative positions of the planets in the firmament, their situations amongst the constellations at the hour of a man's birth, were considered by the ancients to be dominant factors and influences throughout his whole life. It is not too much to say that a belief in the truth of horoscopes cast by a skilled calculator still survives in our Western civilization as well as in the East. Medical science today pays its due respect to astrology in the sign, little altered from the astrological figure of Jupiter, with which all prescriptions are headed. Day, as one of the foremost mathematicians and astronomers of the time, and one employed by the Queen, became continually in request to calculate the nativity and cast a horoscope for men and women in all ranks of life. He has left many notes of people's birth. His own children's are entered with the greatest precision, for which a biographer has to thank him. When Elizabeth mounted with firm steps the throne that her unhappy sister had found so precarious and uneasy a heritage, Day was very quickly sought for at court. His first commission was entirely sui generis. He was commanded by Robert Dudley to name an auspicious day for the coronation, and his astrological calculations thereupon seem to have impressed the Queen and all her courtiers, whether or not we believe in the future auguries of such a combination of influences as presided over the selection of the 14th of January, 1559. Whether or not we believe in the future auguries of such a combination of influences as presided over the selection of the 14th of January, 1559, for the day of crowning Elizabeth in Westminster Abbey, we must acknowledge that Day's choice of a date was succeeded by benign and happy destinies. He was then living in London. We do not know where his lodging was, but several of the books belonging to his library have come down to us with his autograph, Johannes de Londini, and the dates of the year 1555, 1557, and 1558. Elizabeth sent for him soon after her accession, and invited him to her service at Whitehall with all fair promises. He was introduced to Dudley, then and long afterwards her first favorite, so he was likely to stand well. "Where my brother hath given him a crown," she said to Dudley. "Where my brother hath given him a crown," she said to Dudley, or to Dee's other sponsor, the Earl of Pembroke, "I would give him a noble." There was the first of innumerable vague promises made, but it was long indeed before any real and tangible gift was conferred on the astrologer, although he was continually busied about one thing and another at the fancy of the Queen. The reversion of the mastership of St. Catherine's Hospital was promised him, but Dr. Wilson politically prevented me. One morning, the whole court and the Privy Council were put into a terrible flutter by a simple piece of what was common enough in ancient times, and in Egypt, sympathetic magic. A wax image of the Queen had been found lying in London's Inn Fields, with a great pin stuck through its breast, and it was supposed undoubtedly to portend the wasting away and death of Her Majesty, or some other dreadful omen. Messenger after messenger was dispatched to summon day, and bid him make haste. He hurried off, satisfied himself apparently of the harmless nature of the practical joke, and repaired with Mr. Secretary Wilson as a witness of the whole proceedings and a proof of all good faith to Richmond, where the Queen was. The Queen sat in that part of her private garden that sloped down to the river. The Queen sat in her part of her private garden that sloped down to the river, near the steps of the royal landing place at Hampton Court. The Earl of Leicester, as Dudley had now become, was in attendance, gorgeous and insolent as ever. The lords of the Privy Council had also been summoned, when D and Mr. Secretary expounded the inner meaning of this untoward circumstance, and satisfied and allayed all their fears. Something about the calm attributes of this seasoned and travelled scholar seemed always to give moral support to the Queen and her household. This is only the first of many occasions when he had to allay their superstitious fright. That she felt it essential to keep him within reach of herself may have been one reason for not giving him the appointments for which he, and others for him, constantly sued. Day was not an easy person to fit into a living. He required one with no cure of souls attached. For this he says, a cura animarum annexa did terrify me to deal with them. He is called a Bachelor of Divinity by Fox in 1555, and as a matter of fact he does, both in 1558 and in 1564, add the letters S.D.T. to his name in his printed works. This degree also was not from Cambridge. At last he grew tired of waiting, and a certain restlessness in his character, not incompatible with the long patience of the true follower of science, drove him again abroad. His intention was to arrange for printing works already prepared in manuscript, to search among out-of-the-way bookmongers and book-lovers in high-walled German towns for rare treasures wherewith to enrich his native country, was another magnet that drew his feet. In February 1563, after he had been thus employed for more than a year, he wrote from the sign of the Golden Angel in Antwerp to Cecil, to ask if he was expected to return to England, or if he might remain to oversee the printing of his books, and continue his researches among Dutch books and scholars. He had intended, he says, to return before Easter, but this was now impossible, owing to printers' delays. When we remember that 100 years had barely elapsed since the first metal type had been cast and used in a hand press, it is not wonderful that these treatises, with its hieroglyphic and cabalistic signs, took long to print. He announces in the letter to Cecil, a great bargain he has picked up, a work for which many a learned man hath long sought and daily yet doth seek. Upon cipher written, viz. Stenographia, by the famous Abbot Tridemius of Würzburg. It is the earliest elaborate treatise upon shorthand and cipher, a subject in which Cecil was particularly interested. It was then in manuscript, first printed, Frankfurt, 1606. D continues that he knows his correspondent will be well acquainted with the name of the book, for the author mentions it in his epistles, and in both the editions of his Polygraphia. He urges its claim upon the future Lord Treasurer, already a statement of ripe experience in the following words: a book for your honor, or a prince, so meet, so needful and commodious, as in human knowledge none can be meeter or more behooveful. Of this book, either as I now have yet, or hereafter shall have yet, fully whole and perfect. If it pleases you to accept my present, I give you your honor as the most precious jewel that I have yet of other men's travels recovered. He then goes on to beg the minister and secretary of state to procure for him that learned leisure, dosia illa ocia, the fruit whereof my country and all the republic of letters so justly ascribe to your wisdom and honorable zeal toward the advancement of good letters and wonderful, divine, and secret sciences. They had copied in 10 days, by continual labor, about half of the book. A Hungarian nobleman there has offered to finish the rest, if Day will remain in Antwerp and direct his studies for a time. Of this book, the one half was continual labor and watch, the most part of 10 days, have I copied out. And now I stand at the courtesy of a nobleman of Hungary for writing forth the rest, who hath promised me leave thereto, after he shall perceive that I may remain by him longer, with the leave of my prince, to pleasure him also with such points of science as to my hands he requireth. I assure you the means that I use to compass the knowledge where this man and others such are, and likewise of such books as this, as for this present I have advertisement of, have cost me all that ever I could here with honesty borrow, besides that which for a short time intended, I thought needful to bring with me, to the value of Caelib. God knoweth my zeal to honest and true knowledge, for which my flesh, blood, and bones should make the merchandise, if the case so required. D did remain in the Low Countries. He completed his Modus Hieroglyphica, dated its prefatory dedication to Emperor Maximilian II at Antwerp, January 29, 1564, and added an address to the typographer, his singular good friend, Guillermo Silvio, dated the following day. The book appeared in April, and he at once journeyed to Pressburg to present a copy to Maximilian. Its 24 theorems deal with the variations of the figure presented on our title page, which may be roughly explained as the moon, the sun, the elements, the cross, and fire as represented by the waving line below. These says that many university graduates of high degree and other gentlemen dispraised it because they understood it not, but Her Majesty graciously defended my credit and my absence beyond the seas. On his return in June, she sent for him to court and desired him to read the book with her. Dee's account of his regal pupil is given with much quaintness. She vouchsafed to account herself my scholar in my book, and said, whereas I had prefixed in the forefront of the book, que non intelligit aut taxet aut discat. If I would disclose to her the secrets of the book, she would say, et discere et facere. Whereupon her Majesty had a little persuasion of the same with me, and then in most heroical and princely wise did comfort and encourage me in my studies philosophical and mathematical. His escort had been required for the Marchioness of Northampton, who was returning from Antwerp to Greenwich. In return for this assistance, the lady begged the Queen's favor for her cavalier. Elizabeth was always Day's very good friend, and she made a grant to him on December 8, 1564, of the deanery of Gloucester, then void, but other councils prevailed, and it was soon bestowed on some other man. No doubt the appointment would have given great offense, for the popular eye was already beginning to see Day no highly equipped mathematician, geographer, and astronomer, but a conjurer and magician of doubtful reputation. In fact, in the current jargon, one who had dealings with the devil. What there had been at this time to excite these suspicions, beyond the fact that Day was always ready to expound a comet or an eclipse, to cast a horoscope, or explain that the Queen would not immediately expire because of a wax doll with a stiletto in its heart was found under a tree, it is hard to say. But that these rumors were extremely persistent is seen by the astrologer's defense of himself in the very fruitful preface which he, as the first mathematician of the day, was asked to write to Henry Billingsley's first English translation of Euclid's Elements in February 1570. This preface must be reckoned as one of these best achievements, although, as he says in writing it, he was so pinched with straitness of time that he could not pin down the matter as he would. He points out that Euclid had already appeared in Italian, German, High Dutch, French, Spanish, and Portuguese dress, and now at last comes to England. In spite of its ex parte nature, a study of this preface alone must convince any reader that the author was no charlatan or pretender, but a true devotee of learning, gifted with a far insight into human progress. He covers in review every art and science then known. In some, until our days greatly missed, he comments on music and harmony are truly remarkable, and come back to his own predilection, arithmetic, which next to theology is most divine, most pure, most ample and general, most profound, most subtle, most commodious, and most necessary. He quotes Plato to show how it lifts the heart above the heavens by invisible lines, and by its immortal beams melteth the reflection of light incomprehensible, and so procureth joy and perfection unspeakable. Speaking of the refraction of light, he foreshadows the telescope as he describes how the captain of either foot or horseman should empty an astronomical staff commodiously framed for carriage and use, and may wonderfully help himself by perspective glasses, in which I trust our posterity will prove more skillful and expert to the greater purpose than in these days can almost be credited to be possible. Then he alludes to a wonderful glass belonging to Sir William P., famous for his skill in mathematics, who will let the glass be seen. The passage seems to show the looking glasses were not common, or that this particular one was a convex mirror. A man, he says, may be cursely afraid of his own shadow, yea, so much to fear, that you being alone near a certain glass, and proffer with dagger or sword to foreign at the glass. You shall suddenly be moved to give back in manner by reason of an image appearing in the air between you and the glass, with like hand, sword, or dagger, and with like quickness, pointing at your very eyes, like as you do at the glass. Strange, this is to hear of, but more marvelous to behold than these my words can signify. Nevertheless, by demonstration optical, the order and cause thereof is certified, even so the effect is consequent. The mirror was given to John Dee not long afterwards. From optics, he passes on to mechanics and mentions having seen at Praha mills worked by water, sawing great and long deal boards, no man being by. He describes accurately a diving chamber supplied with air and sums up some of the mechanical marvels of the world. The brazen head made by Albertus Magnus, which seemed to speak, a strange self-moving which he saw at St. Denis in 1551, images seen in the air by means of a perspective glass, Archimedes' sphere, the dove of Archytas, and the wheel of Vulcan, spoken of by Aristotle, and comes down to recent workmanship in Nuremberg, where an artificer let fly an insect of iron that buzzed about the guests at table, and then returned to his master's hand again as though it were weary. All these things are easily achieved, he says, by skill, will, industry, and ability duly applied to proof. But is any honest student or a modest Christian philosopher to be, for such like feats, mathematically and mechanically wrought, counted and called a conjurer? Shall the folly of idiots and the malice of scornful shall the folly of idiots and the malice of the scornful so much prevail that he who seeketh no worldly gain or glory at their hands, but only of God, the treasurer of heavenly wisdom, and knowledge of pure verity, shall he, I say, in the mean space, be robbed and spoiled of his honest name and fame? He that seeketh by S. Paul's advertisement in the creature's properties and wonderful virtues, to find just cause to glorify the eternal and almighty Creator by, shall that man be condemned as a companion of hell-hounds, and a caller and conjurer of wicked damned spirits? Then he recounts his years of study and asks, should I have fished with so large and costly a net, and been so long time drawing, even with the help of Lady Philosophy and Queen Theology, and at length have catched but a frog, nay, a devil? How great is the blindness and boldness of the multitude in things above their capacity! Then he refers to some who have appeared against him in print. O my unkind countrymen, O unnatural countrymen, O unthankful countrymen, O brain sick, rash, spiteful and disdainful countrymen, why oppress you me thus violently with your slandering of me, contrary to verity, and contrary to your own conscience, and I to this hour, neither by word, deed, or thought, have been in any way hurtful, damageable, or injurious to you or yours. Have I so long, so dearly, so far, so carefully, so painfully, so dangerously fought, and travailed for the learning of wisdom and attaining of virtue, and in the end am I become worse than when I began, worse than a madman, a dangerous member in the commonwealth, and no member of the church of Christ? Call you this to be learned? Call you this to be a philosopher and a lover of wisdom? He goes on to speak of examples before his time, to whom in godliness and learning he is not worthy to be compared. Patient Socrates, Apuleius, Johannes Picus, and Trithemius, Roger Bacon, the flower of whose worthy fame can never die nor wither, and ends by summing up the people who can conceive nothing outside the compass of their capacity as of four sorts: vain, prattling busybodies, fond friends, and perfectly zealous and malicious ignorant. Of these he is inclined to think the fond friends the most damaging, for they overshoot the mark and relate marvels and wonderful feats which were never done, or had any spark of livelihood to be done, in order that other men may marvel at their hap to have such a learned friend. The eloquent irony of this passage seems equally only by its The eloquent irony of this passage seems equaled only by its extraordinary universality, its knowledge of human character, and its high philosophic spirit. At what a cost did a seeker after scientific truths follow his calling in the 16th century!